Hello, everybody. We're just going to wait for another minute and then we're going to kick this off. Welcome, Marco.
Thank you, Eddie. Great being here.
You bet. So we'll just wait for 1 minute and then we'll do an official introduction. Hey, Marco, are you anywhere near, you're in Great Barrington, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Southern Berkshire County, known
Uh-huh.
for a lot of things, including great ice cream. So the ice cream joint is called SoCo for Southern County.
Oh, well, I obviously have to go there now.
Oh, you bet. On a hot day, I mean, like today, people are just lining up around the block, literally.
Nice. I actually was married up there and then went to uh, the what was the town that Norman Rockwell painted?
Stockbridge,
Stockbridge. Right. Went
right
to
by the Red
Stockbridge
Lion
afterward.
Inn in the museum there, and
Yeah, we went to the Red Lion Inn for dinner.
awesome.
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
great.
it's a great place. It's a great place. And were you married in Stockbridge or were you married in one of the other towns?
No, Pittsfield. So
Great.
we went north and then went south.
Well, Pittsfield's having a resurgence.
Is it good? It's a
It's
charming
like
town.
a 20-year resurgence, mind you. It's still recovering from GE leaving.
Yeah. Well, it's a charming town. It's absolutely charming.
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to kick this off. So we are really happy to have the author of Primitive, Tapping the Primal Drive that Powers the World's Most Successful People. He's spearheaded marketing communications and public affairs for an array of Fortune 500 companies. Previously, a managing director at global PR giant Burstyn Marsteller. Very impressive. He also happens to be my neighbor in Manhattan's Upper West Side when he's not in the Berkshires. Marco Greenberg is here. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you for having me, Eddie.
All right. Just for those that are attending, we can't see or hear you, but have no fear. We would love you to ask questions throughout this hour, and you can Slack Jessie Resnick with questions, and then you can see she's attending here, and she'll just pop on and ask those questions. All right, so I'm going to try something a little new today. I'm going to begin with something very intense. It's called it's called the Gauntlet. And if you don't get every question right, then we're going to stop the interview right away. How about that?
That sounds very fair to me,
There's
actually.
no pressure. There's no pressure, but we just can't move on with this interview if you don't get this right.
Bring it on.
Okay. All right, ready?
Yes.
Take a deep breath. Here we go. Ready? Here we go. Peanut butter, smooth or crunchy?
Crunchy.
All right, you passed. Cats or dogs?
Oh, that's a hard one. I love them both, but I have to go with dogs.
Dogs. Oh, poor cats. Movie or Broadway show?
Movie.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
All right. Game of Thrones, season 1 or season 8?
Season 1.
All right. This is a tough one. John Oliver or Bill Maher?
Bill Maher. That was easy for me. Maybe I'm showing too much my politics or allegiance to HBO, although they're both right.
You didn't even have to think about that one. There's a story there. We have to dig deeper.
Yeah.
All right. Next, The Big Bang Theory or Friends?
Friends. Showing my age a little bit.
All right. You get 3 to choose from. Batman, Superman, or Wonder Woman?
Batman.
Interesting. All right. This is a tough one. HBO Max or Amazon Prime?
That's an easy one, HBO.
All right.
You have to know your audience, right, Eddie?
Know your audience. Know your audience. Lesson 1. Okay. Finally, La La Land or An American in Paris?
La La Land. I'm from Los Angeles, which a lot of people call La La Land.
All right. There you go. I'm happy to announce that you have passed. I know it was tough. But
The easiest standardized test I've ever taken.
you almost tripped up on the peanut butter question, but you regained yourself later on, so
Just
that's
blow out of the gate.
good. All right. So you wrote Primitive. Tell me a little bit about what drew you to write this book about this particular subject.
As you mentioned earlier, I'm a marketing and PR guy. This is my
Yeah.
first book.
Yep.
I'm one of those examples of never being too old or too young to do something different. Originally, the book was designed to be about marketing. How do you get it out there? Luckily, I have an agent who is oppositional. We'll talk about that in a moment. And he said, marketing books are a dime a dozen. Can't you think deeper than that? He said, think about the people you've worked with over your career. So I sat down on a red couch similar to this red couch, and I thought to myself, amongst the CEOs of Fortune 1000 companies, amongst the CEOs and founders of startups, crazy scientists, mad artists, the first thing that occurred to me is these people are friggin' nuts. These people march to their own drum. They're free spirits. They throw out the civilized rule book.
Yeah.
In today's nomenclature, they're often called eccentrics, mavericks, disruptors, change agents, etc. But I soon discovered that there's something deeper going on here, right? Without getting into neuroscience, because I'm certainly not a neuroscientist, although I work with them, there's a primitive brain that's fast and intuitive and instinctive and based largely on fight or flight. And there's a cerebral brain, which is more methodical, more rational, more logical. Kind of like the Logical song by Supertramp, right? We sent away talking so logical, rational, practical, etc. What scientists recently discovered is that we have to look back at the primitive brain and realize that we don't necessarily disparage it. We shouldn't put it always on the back burner, but rather embrace it. There's something special going on here. So that's the idea behind the book. Obviously, the title is provocative, the word primitive. It's a loaded term. I'm deliberately reclaiming it in the most positive, pure sense. And like nature, there's a reason I have plants behind me, like animals, like children, which appear a lot in my book in terms of having that purity and innocence that the good side of primitive conveys. So that's a little bit of the unlikely journey, both as a writer, but also in terms of subject matter.
So are you suggesting that we, as we experience life and go through our different ups and downs and challenges, that we become less attuned to our primitive self?
Absolutely. And the research bears that out, right? I mean, there was a study conducted at the Harvard Business School that the average kid, say 6 or 7 years old, asks 300 questions a day. By the time they become teenagers, it's almost nothing. So the curiosity and the passion and the self-motivation often gets beaten out of us, right? And look, there are a lot of archetypes out there, as we all know. There's, introvert and extrovert, and morning person and night person, and type A, knows what, etc. So I'm being somewhat audacious here in saying that there are another two archetypes, right? There are those that are primitive, which are those that march to their own drum, as we discussed. But the flip side of that are people who are more civilized. Those are people who are more hierarchical, who are more measured, who are more process driven. And it's a spectrum out there. I'm a bit of a mutt, although I definitely skew in the primitive direction. But I think the point is we need both. We need that yin yang, that zigzag, especially in organizations, to help take us to the next level.
Right. So is your suggestion that some people that are primitive, or I would say some people that are more non-primitive, they've been inducted into the world of non-primitive behavior,
Civilized world.
the civilized world, are they? Do they need to wake up? Do they need to be aware of the more primitive side of themselves?
I think self-awareness is something that we can all benefit from. And my book is a bit of a hybrid. On one hand, it's a career book. On the other hand, a business book, a little bit of memoir, but it's also self-help. And
Right.
there are those that disparage self-help. I think we're in a very difficult time for reasons we all know, for a variety of reasons. We're all living in this perfect storm, and we could all use a little bit of self-help. And kind of the more civilized mantra that we've heard for the last couple of decades of "it's all good," sometimes it's not all good. And so
Yeah.
I think for those that are more civilized, again, those who cross the T's, dot the I's, are really adhering to schedule and process and timeline, and God bless them. We need people like that in all organizations. But I think those people especially are often feeling stuck and not always satisfied, and are looking to take a calculated risk or looking to leapfrog ahead. They feel that, I've been a good little girl and good little boy and stood in line and gone to the right
Yeah.
schools and got the right degrees and got the right work experience, but I'm not feeling fulfilled. So even before COVID and before the BLM protests and before the terrible unemployment that we're seeing, there were 68% of people surveyed that said they're burnt out in one way or another. So you can still be civilized and tap into that primitive spirit in order to get that fuel injection, that supercharging, if you will, that a lot of people are missing.
So your suggestion is that, if I'm understanding it correctly, is that if you're civilized and you tap into some of your primitive nature, that this can help you navigate times like we're living in right now with COVID, uncertainty, all sorts of different challenges going on in the world that we don't have control over, but we need to figure out how to navigate.
Oh, you're totally right. And
Okay.
my first job when I was at Columbia University was at a gym, and I was a personal trainer. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things I was told by one of my favorite clients, a renowned neurologist, was, he said, "Marco, you've got to specialize. You need that domain expertise. Successful people always are specialists." Now, it might have been more true then, but I think it's less true now. And per your point, Eddie, in the turbulent times that we're living in, we're seeing a lot of domain experts be punished and generalists being rewarded. In other words, people who sometimes have more non-traditional backgrounds, who have experience in various areas, who are more decathletes, let's say, than running one event, are more adept, are more nimble, are more fleet in terms of getting ahead and getting what they want. And look, there are tons of examples of that. One of the ones that I'm most proud of that I talk about in my book, and I'm an avid reader, so it's extra intimidating to send my book to one of my favorite authors, but I did that early on, and he was kind enough with a great blurb. And his name is Alan Lightman. And if any of you guys know, he wrote a book called Einstein's Dreams. Fast forward, he wrote a book recently that was based on a TED Talk called In Praise of Wasting Time. He is both an astrophysicist, he is an author, he is a social entrepreneur going to Cambodia and creating a new educational platform for women leaders in Southeast Asia who previously weren't even allowed to live in a dormitory with the guys. So I think Alan is an example. His right brain and left brain are both on fire. I wish I was so lucky. But the idea is that sometimes being more agnostic, not wedded to any one technology or any one device. Certainly folks at Xander are very familiar with that term. I apply it in a more career trajectory way in terms of your professional life, the benefits of eating at that buffet. And I think the good news is a lot of big companies present those options, but we have to know how to ask.
Sure.
We have to know how to listen for those opportunities.
Yeah, I find through my own observation, I find that a lot of people are waiting for permission to do a lot of things that they are fully empowered to do on their own. And part of my interaction with people is letting them know that they are fully empowered to do this. They don't need my permission or anyone else's permission in order to
Absolutely.
go for it.
And I think you find people that skew more primitive. And this is also something for people that are more civilized to think about. And yes, I'm developing what I call a PQ quiz. What's our primal? What's our primitive quotient? We know our EQ, we know our IQ, but how do we work in that way?
Sure.
That's more key today than ever before. And the permission, I like to say that primitives don't ask for permission, and that sometimes they don't ask for forgiveness either. But we all know the adage about it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. The CYA culture can be lethal in terms of progress, in terms of moving forward. One of the things that I talk about in the book, I sprinkle it with uber primitives that we might know, right? Elon Musk is one example, Ariana Huffington, Oprah, et cetera, et cetera. But there are other people out there that are flying a little under the radar that have made what I call primitive moves to jump ahead in their own career. One that I profile, which is in the agnostic chapter, actually two people. One is a guy named Love Welchel, who I'd be happy to talk about, but long story short, he went from being a roadie for NWA to a top executive at Y&R, and we met when we were both in the WPP family. And then he went on to being Sean Combs's right-hand man, right? So he adapts, he jumps from one opportunity to the other. The other is Tanya Valle, who went literally for being an internet and entertainment PR guru to shoveling duty at the Bronx Zoo, to then being a New York One reporter. So again, sometimes that necessitates jumping to another job. Sometimes you're in an organization that appreciates that diversity, both obviously the racial, the ethnic, gender, sexual identification, et cetera, but also the diversity of thought.
Right.
Embracing people that are called non-traditionals rather than saying everyone has to be a cookie cutter and fall in line.
Right. So you have these two ideas of people that fall into different categories. One is called homing, which is hierarchical, occupational, measured, insulated, non-confrontational, and grounded.
Correct.
And one is roaming, which is more attuned to sort of the primitive aspects, which is relentless, oppositional, agnostic, messianic. Sometimes some people say messianic. We'll see.
Right.
Insecure, nuts, which is my favorite, and gallant.
Totally.
So how did you go about defining what this was and choosing those specific words?
Love that. Well, when I determined that the most successful people in my own experience and then discovered through research are a little out there, nuts, crazy in a good way, right? I want to be sensitive to anyone that has experienced mental illness. I share my own struggles. We're talking, folks, about the good kind of crazy. So I just want to, I want to make that absolutely clear. But there's that relationship between the two. And as said, there's a spectrum out there. And I'll give you an example. Mark Benioff from Salesforce is known to be pretty out there, right? In terms of being a maverick in the industry. I sat down with a Forbes reporter, Alex Conrad, while I was writing the book, and he said, it's true that in your lexicon, Mark is quite primitive, but did you know that his co-founder, Parker Harris, is actually very civilized? Keeps him on the rails, right? And we've seen, and there are some cautionary tales, as you know, in my book, about some primitives that go off the rails.
Yeah.
And, we can talk about that. One is a former client we work, and we know that story. But it's an important one for us to remember. And that's why I say, I'm more focused on those primitives who are evolved, because it's certainly not a call to be crude or coarse. it's a call to really have the breakout success that we're all looking for. So I contrast the roaming and homing. I think, you know, the roaming is like our cell phone when we go into a new country, but it's also something that we've been doing for 90% of our existence
Yeah.
as a human species, right? We haven't always been tied to a screen, let alone a desk and a chair. We've been exploring, we've been nomadic, we've been on the high plains, etc. So one of the things that I try to do in the acronym of roaming is make this thing accessible. I don't want to be another business book that's all theory and research and just a dry, boring read. Nor do I want to be another business book that's an old guy just, you know, telling war stories about I worked with this one and that one, et cetera, et cetera. I want something that's different. And I want something that can really touch people on a personal level, not just a professional level. And I go through that that acronym, as you know, in terms of identifying different people in my life and through my reading that really exemplify that. And happy to give some examples. But I warned you, Eddie, I'm a PR guy, so I talk too much.
It's okay. I will stop you if you talk too much. We have a full hour, so let's use it. So you give a lot of examples. A lot of you've talked to a lot of people through the process of doing this book. What was the process of assembling this book like? How did you decide on these people?
The process of assembling this book was the hardest, yet inevitably most rewarding thing that I've done. I had no idea. I'm a primitive who's more in touch with running a sprint or a series of short sprints. So if I work with great people like Rob Wheeler, shout out to Rob, running your communications effort at Xander, an op-ed, 800,000 words come natural, right? A book is a different animal. And the process, frankly, is more civilized. At a terrific publisher in Hachette, it's very methodical. It's incremental. It's thorough. It's many reviews and many edits. As a friend of mine said, it's a rolling series of deadlines.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate in assembling a great team to support me, both helping me on the editing and the writing and the research. And again, the only way I could do it was to take my own medicine. In other words, there's a term that you mentioned that we can, pronounce differently, messianic. I first heard that term when I was working at that gym and going to graduate school at Columbia University. And another client said to me, you know, Marco, and this guy was working for one of the big billionaires at the time. You guys remember the Seagram and Sons? Edgar Sr., they own the Seagram building. That's why it's called the Seagram building on Park Avenue. He said to me, Marco, you know, those people who are truly successful are messianic about their career. And I said, Steve, wow, that sounds cult-like. That sounds like really disturbing, grandiose out there. I don't want that.
Sure.
I discovered, thinking back on my own career and people that I've had the good fortune to work with and those that I know about, it's like, that's actually true. So back to my agent, he said, Marco, if you want to get this done and work this process, you have to be messianic about the writing of this book. What that means is you have to write with zeal, write with not just purpose and passion, but that this is your raison d'etre for what you're doing on planet Earth, and it's divine. And you don't have to be religious or even spiritual to buy into it. But I couldn't have done that without that civilized side of working the process and having people help me do that. And also the very primitive side of saying, you know what? Putting yourself first is not selfish, as the adage goes. Mm-hmm. And it was important for me to take some of my own medicine and be messianic. And guys, I did it in my mid-50s. And I always downplayed that stuff. I worked hard, but I was never really like, oh my God, this is the be all and end all. And if you really look at those people who are crazy enough to reach that level of success, they have that level of quote unquote religious devotion. Again, even if they're not quote unquote religious.
So do you think this is your final book? Or do you think this is the beginning of a new chapter in your life?
I'm an agnostic primitive. So I like to walk and chew gum at the same time, and I like to dabble at various things. I fell into the agency business because I couldn't sit still, and I would have been diagnosed back then with some learning differences, as my kids have, but then they didn't call it that. They just called it slow in math. Yeah, the pejorative terms. So I do think I have another book in me, but right now I'm messianic about getting the word out about primitive, tapping
Right.
the primal drive that powers the world's most successful people for a lot of reasons. But one is, and forgive me if this sounds corny, but when I get feedback from people, especially from strangers, saying that this really helped them see their own career trajectory in a different light, and help them. Yes, part of what true primitives do, and this is what we mean by gallant, in terms of caring about the other and being noble. That's actually my favorite chapter, and you know a person that's in that chapter that we can talk about later. But it's very much key to what I'm doing. So to be able to make an impact, you know, they say success. When I say successful people, a lot of people think about money. And, you know, it's true. Like the old quote says, I've been rich and I've been poor. And rich
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
I literally have been rich and I've been poor. Like a lot of you probably have, right? But so
Sure.
it's success is also making a positive impact. It's really, really that ability to put some points on the board, hopefully for a good cause. It's independence. It's the ability to roam. It's also fun. You know, we have a lot of the fun stripped out of things. And we end the book with a quote about like, true primitives don't know if it's work or if it's play.
Sure.
Yeah, it also gets into the kid-like thing of like, rather than having meetings, let's have play dates. You know, let's return to the kid in all of us.
So in the Messianic section, you mentioned that Messianic people have that vision. They wave a magic wand and they can see what will happen in the future. What do you expect to happen? Why don't you wave that magic wand for primitive and tell us what's going to happen with it in an idealized way?
Wow, that is a penetrating question. Look, I had my session with my shrink.
Do you have low expectations of me, Marco? What's going on?
I am a neurotic, shrink-going, Upper West Side Jewish person, okay? And so I can say this, everybody. I have an audacious BHAG, right? We all know BHAG, Big Hairy Audacious Goal.
Mm-hmm.
And I really hope, for the sake of everyone who works for a living, that we can include this lexicon, these two dueling archetypes, in our vocabulary to
Mm-hmm.
boost self-awareness, to boost satisfaction, and at the end of the day, boost success. Because there are so many passive aggressive, risk averse, overly cautious, CYA, I don't want to own it, I don't want to offend anyone, etc., that we're all kind of going through a landmine. And I think part of the exercise here is to be very respectful of the other, but also being able to have healthy and constructive disagreements. You know, when I worked at BBDO, who invented the brainstorm, we were told when you're in a brainstorm, you can only say positive things. So if someone throws out an idea, great idea, Susie. Great idea, Christine. I love what Jack just said. I love what Eddie just said. Da da da. I mean, that's at least what I was taught, guys, back in the mid '90s at BBDO, and that extended. And that, I think, that kind of mindset spilled over into work life. And there's a reason for that. It's great to give props. it's great to give strokes. People want that affirmation. But I think we've also thrown the baby out with the bathwater, and the ability to say, I disagree, here's why, rather than just be yes people. And the research also bears out that we think being obsequious and just agreeing is going to get us ahead, but oftentimes our supervisors want constructive critique. They want pushback. And when we don't give it to them, they respect us less.
I have seen that multiple times. And I just want to tie this to Warner Media and the world that we're in right now when it comes to Xandr. Our new CEO has suggested that he values risk takers. He values people that don't just play by the rules, but want to push the limits. So it sounds, I'm interpreting this to say, for people that are used to doing the prescriptive thing that we've been taught to do over a certain while, to reconsider that, to think about how you can approach that in a different way using some of these primitive terms. So what I've learned in our conversation is that you can actually have multiple, you can align yourself to multiple areas, categories within being primitive that you mentioned in the book. And if you need to draw upon a certain area in order to push you in a certain direction, we all have that within us, just like you did to write the book. We all have that within us to focus in on being messianic, or focus in on being nuts, or whatever it is that we need to do to push ourselves out of our current, let's call it complacency, or our current state into the next level, that we can challenge ourselves.
Absolutely. And we need to now more than ever, especially when we're working at home. And obviously there's some advantages and disadvantages, but as I heard a colleague once say, there's no spontaneity on Zoom, right? We plan the Zoom call. It's not someone coming by our desk and shooting the you-know-what and having just an organic brainstorm of, hey, have you thought about doing it this way or instead this way, etc. So back to your question, we can take these attributes a la carte, right? There are plenty of people that can step back and say, you know what, like I did, I need to be more messianic about this stage in my career. There are other people that can step back and say something else and say, you know what, maybe I'm overconfident. One of the more counterintuitive traits, again, we have roaming guys, right? It's like you said, relentless, and it's not just working hard. We can return to that. It's not losing that big target. It's the oppositional, the courage to give constructive critique, challenge, agnostic, not being wedded, messianic. We talked about. One thing that we haven't gotten into is
also not going too far, knowing where the limits are,
absolutely,
so you can be successful within your.
People can go off the rails. I talk about Adam Newman in the book. There are many examples, whether it's Travis at Uber on down, of taking this too far. Like anything in life, guys, it's about the balance. But if the pendulum is swung too far in the civilized direction, it's time that we infuse a little bit of what's intuitive, what's innate, what's instinctive. I've had a lot of people come to me after reading the book, including a journalist friend who works for one of the biggest publications, not the New York Times. It's one that competes with the New York Times. And she said to me, and she's an amazing Pulitzer Prize winner, went to the best schools, great articles, books. She goes, Marco, that's my problem. I'm too civilized. I'm too civilized in my career. I'm not giving pushback. I'm asking for permission rather than just taking a risk and doing it, and I might fail. I think the converse is the methodology, I hope, also helps people not just with their own self-awareness, but with awareness of the people that they work with. So rather than saying that so-and-so is an absolute nut job and impatient and unrealistic and crazy, you could say, that person is messianic about our company and about what they want to do. They're also a little bit nuts too. So we can we can help reframe both our own mindset and also the behavior of those around us. And I am one, I put myself, as you know this, as a poster boy for insecure, right?
Sure.
Just because we're paranoid doesn't mean they're not trying to kill us. And part of my book is about, how do you weaponize that anxiety rather than dismiss it, ignore it, and mask it with machismo and bravado. One of the people we talk about in the book is one of the top executives at YouTube. Maybe some of you guys have worked with her, Ricky Drury, a former colleague of mine. She actually worked for me in my first agency, but I was confused. I didn't know if I actually worked for her rather than her working for me. I mean, that's how oppositional she could be. I loved her and we're great friends. She runs marketing in EMEA for YouTube. And we quote her in the book saying, "I'm the most insecure person I know." That's what she says. She shares the vulnerability and the anxiety with her team. It makes her more relatable. And certainly we don't want to have that insecurity on such a high flame that we can't operate.
Right. That particular story actually she was having a negative time at work, right? People were having a negative reaction to her. She had pushed the boundary too far without sharing a side of herself. And so it actually created the opportunity for an event where she was able to share, she had to share more of herself in order to stop her team from leaving.
Absolutely. Hey, you read the book, Eddie.
I read it this past weekend, and yes, I do recognize people that I work with in this book. I recognize them.
She told me a story, and I've known her since the mid-90s. Never heard the story that no one came to her bat mitzvah because there was a prank pulled and there was another bat mitzvah going on, and she was so scarred by that when she's doing events for Google and YouTube, her natural intuition is maybe nobody will show up. Now, obviously that can make her better, but it was freaking out her team without the proper context and the perspective. So once she shared more of herself and once she listened to others, it wasn't turned into group therapy, but there was communication there. And I think a lot of us are guilty of thinking that people around us are mind readers, and rather than using our words like we tell kids to do and communicating, the stuff builds up and we only hear about it afterwards. And that's kind of, frankly, I find that more amongst those who skew civilized because they're more non-confrontation. And that can become passive aggressive.
One of my favorite quotes in the book, I have it here, let's see, is actually something that, I don't know, it was just, it was not pointed out in any particular way or bold in any way, but I thought it really spoke to me. In the absence of prudent paranoia is complacency, which I thought was a really meaningful sentence. It's actually good to have a certain level of paranoia at your job because and I witnessed this quite a bit, when we come into a job and we start doing all the things that they ask us to do as soon as we're onboarded, and then we go through learn about the different processes and how to do certain things, and we begin to get inducted into that culture, and that culture can very well encourage complacency.
Absolutely. For those of you that are online, and most of you are, look up the Dunning-Kruger effect. That's when incompetent people think they're competent. Dunning-Kruger, two psychologists that did the research, this is on the opposite side of the spectrum of an imposter, right? We think we're fooling people. And I talk about everyone from Sheryl Sandberg to other luminaries that can suffer from this in terms of, hey, do I really deserve this? Am I fooling people? And I think if you have some of that imposter syndrome, it can be a very good thing. I think if you're too confident, and most Americans, as an example, 90% think they're above average drivers. I'm not a math guy, but that's statistically impossible. You can't have 90% that's above average. So the complacency, there's the creative constraints, complacency, The constraints can fight against the complacency. Being a little bit unsettled can also make us perform and take it to the next level. So we talk about a woman in the book who is a fencer, and she's a devout Muslim, and she became a fencer because she could still cover her head and compete and she actually went on to the US to represent the US team. So that was a constraint, right? Hard to play basketball or some other sports, but this was ideal. And she used that to her advantage. So we need to, light a fire under our collective you-know-what during this existential time and say, what do we really want to do while we're here? And I think the good news is even jobs that might seem mundane can be made exciting. My first gig at a big agency, I was asked to promote bereavement bouquets for FTD. This got cut from the book. A lot of stuff got cut from the book, as probably it should have, but I'll just share this with the group. It's hard to think of anything a little bit more even depressing than I am going to promote bereavement bouquets. For those that don't know, FTD was before 1-800, okay? This was before we were ordering online. But guess what? Instead of saying, who am I to promote these FTD bouquets? I have fancy degrees, etc. I actually got into it. I got into the people and the client and the competition and the research and the client base. So I think there's an ability to wave the magic wand and be messianic about seemingly mundane things. We talk about a professor at Yale who's done research on job crafting. So I don't know if you remember this, Eddie, in a hospital system, she interviewed janitors.
I do recall.
They don't see themselves as custodians. They see themselves as healers. They check in on the patients. They notice if someone's eaten or not eaten. They tell a joke. They talk to the family. So much of it is really about our mentality rather than our credentials.
We had a question come from one of the readers at Xander, which I thought was so interesting. She said, Ludwig, who's someone who you interviewed, explained that physical vulnerability and psychological unease were key traits of success. And the question is, have you spoken to anyone in 2020 who's been able to successfully harness the physical vulnerability and psychological unease of this year to do something spectacular?
I'll look next to the person in my own bed, my wife. During the height of COVID, she decided to apply for a new job. And rather than wait in line for the head of HR to tap her, sometimes you got to go to the top. And she went to the CEO of a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center. Yes, my wife is also agnostic. She was an actress. We have some actors here, Eddie, that can, use
active informer. Yes,
exactly. And what she discovered after losing her own father to a drug overdose when he was 37 years old, she left acting through relationship expert, talking head, writing, and is now a certified certified substance abuse and alcohol counselor, CASAC. So in the middle of COVID, at the end of April, she used the uncertainty, the unease. Addiction is skyrocketing right now. We've only seen the tip of the iceberg. It's ugly out there. It's going to get even worse. And now she is in Pittsfield, Mass., a city that some would say has seen better times, although it's seen some very good times, as we know. You know that city, Eddie. But when GE pulled out, a lot of bad stuff happened. So yes, many examples, starting with those examples that are close to home, but also thinking about, the unease of people that I've worked with in, let's say, Israel in the tech scene, which they call Startup Nation. And the book is dedicated to a dear friend of mine who was the first person who killed on 9/11. He fought back on Flight 11. He was a former commando in the Israel Defense Forces. His name was Danny Lewin. It was murdered at 31. He was the co-founder of Akamai Technologies. You guys know about Akamai, but talk about
We're very familiar with Akamai, yes.
exactly. Talk about unease. Well, content distribution, I hope I'm not, I don't know the relationship exactly, so I hope I'm not speaking out of
Don't worry, you didn't step in it. It's fine.
Okay, good. But Danny would call me from the MIT dorm saying, I don't know how I can, pay back these loans. I don't know how I'm going to make it. But then the next conversation was, hey, why don't you join me on this crazy MIT entrepreneurship competition? And we have this great idea for distributing content on the World Wide Web. Let's turn the World Wide Web into something fast and reliable and secure. Guys, that was the genesis from Akamai. And it was the seed of someone who was surrounded by unease. And it catapulted him and the company and the web to a totally new level. But again, the positive headline here is it's accessible for all of us if we just take some calculated risks, have some self-awareness, say to ourselves, you know what, maybe I could be a little more agnostic. Maybe, I love being in HR, but maybe I could try marketing, or maybe finance is my thing, or maybe I want to learn how to code. And certainly the importance of coding was drilled into my head, but not by none other than Kirk McDonald. And Kirk, when he first said this to me, he said, and for those that don't know, I worked with Kirk back at PubMatic as well, and he said, we need to be code empathetic. We need to understand the import of it, right? Even if we don't code. And I think that's an example also of an agnostic mindset of getting how we can, yes, play on different fields and connect the dots.
I love that you brought up Kirk. And of course, we all know Kirk here. So how did Kirk end up in the book? Tell us the story of the Kirk McDonald intuitive book.
I knew there was a place for Kirk. I wasn't sure where, and it's kind of like when you're filming a documentary, you're not sure what's going to end on the cutting room floor and what's going to be in the piece and what's going to lead the piece, and et cetera, et cetera. Same with writing the book, right? So I get Kirk on the phone. I remember it very, very well. And first I say, here's the premise. These are the archetypes. Kirk, as we know, is very quick. He gets it. He said, Marco, stop. You skew more primitive. I might skew more primitive, but we're writing this for the colleagues and friends and family who are actually more civilized. And we leverage this mindset to take things to the next level. I said, you totally get it. And then, like he always does, he taught me a lot. And one was starting, and his father tragically had passed away not that long before we spoke. And he told me the story about his dream to buy a red BMW for his father. And I lost my father when my dad was 55, and I was also close to my dad. So right when he went down that road, it spoke to me on a very, very heartfelt level. And he was able to buy that red BMW for his father. And that's when I realized Kirk could be in any chapter, right? He could be in Relentless, he could be in Agnostic, he could be in Messianic. We thought about him for Insecure, but he's so much more than that. When I say Insecure, he goes, Marco, I'm an imposter too. I said, I'm an imposter too. I didn't realize you're an imposter. I'm an imposter. So part of this is a big, putting our cards on the table and showing where we're coming from and what we're really thinking. But the thing that got me on Kirk was the other. It's putting the other oftentimes before yourself, whether it's a mentor or whether that's a family member. And for those that have not heard it, Kirk tells the story in my book about being on the island of St. John and almost drowning. And what kept him afloat, literally and figuratively, was his family and surviving for them. That, friends, is a primal gut instinct. That is not something that we're trained. That is not something that we're inculcated by school. We just, like a dog throwing into the water, they just know how to swim. And a lot of us know how to swim, but instead, as a psychologist who I talk about in the book, Albert Ellis says, we're shooting on ourselves. what we should do, what we think society wants us to do, what our parents want us to do, what our significant other wants us to do. And we're engaging in our fair share of what Albert Ellis calls mustibation. I must do this. I must do that. Whereas you can step back and say, it would be nice if we did this, but if we don't, there's an alternative.
Sure. So give me some practical steps that someone who has just read the book and is civilized can do to help get more in touch with their primitive sides.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to get in touch with your primitive side is to think about what the little boy, the little girl, the little child in you wanted to do. In other words, when I give career advice, I say, do not just what you're passionate about, because a lot of people don't know what they're passionate about. Sometimes you stumble upon that, but do what comes easily, what's organic, what's natural for you. I was always someone that, struggled to pass math. I got into UC Berkeley in 1982 and I failed my senior math class, and my high school counselor said, "How did you do it?" I said, "I don't know, they let me in." So I'm one that I acknowledge those insecurities off the bat, but I do know how to write, I do know how to speak, I do know how to persuade. So it's finding that inside of you and then going for it. The other piece of advice that I would have is develop your side course. You don't necessarily have to do a 180. You don't even have to do a sharp left or a sharp right. You could have a side engagement that's a cause, that's a nonprofit, that's writing, that also fuels your primitive fire, if you will. And we've seen Kirk do that as well with his work with Mouse and other nonprofit organizations that give disadvantaged kids a leg up and an opportunity that they otherwise didn't have. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can tap into that. The easiest way is to look at roaming and say, what am I deficient in? What ingredients can I add into my own professional mix to keep it interesting? And a lot of it comes down with interviewing and talking to other people and seeing what they're working on, rather than sticking in your silo with blinders on. With all due respect to AI and machine learning, and you guys are kings of it, your success is also about primarily the people, the talent, the intellectual capital that you have going.
It's always about the talent. It's always about the talent. The rest is just nice.
Yeah.
Tell me, you mentioned earlier that you're an avid reader. What are your top 3 books? What are those books that we should be reading at Xander?
I'll go back and forward. One is the Progress Paradox by Greg Easterbrook. The subtitle is something like, why do we keep feeling worse when things are going better? It's a lotto mentality that we feel somehow we're missing out, that we're not getting it. And, in the old days, if someone was super successful, the whole family would benefit. Now we're all these individual warriors out there. And if we feel that we don't hit the big IPO, the big exit, that we're some loser. Far from it. The Progress Paradox. Check out Deep Work by Cal Newport. It is an amazing book about being productive in a distracted age. The only way I got to finish this book was not just being messianic, but turning off this when I got in the zone. Multitasking, yes, you can do it, but you're going to be less efficient. And the third book, and I'm thinking originally here, none of these questions, people, I was given in advance. Just want to know that. I still have to finish it, but the biography of Edith Wharton.
Oh, she's terrific. Yeah.
Remember, one of the great writers of all times. Her house is in Lenox. She used to write on the bed in the morning from 5 in the morning till noon, and then spend a life of leisure. But to be a woman writer in those days was almost unheard of. And she was very primitive. She ended up divorcing her husband because it wasn't giving her the satisfaction that she was looking for. But she in her biography, which is like this thick, you see how she put together Ethan Frome and all the other books. So I think reading out there, we all should do more of it. And you know, they say the mark of true intelligence is speaking intelligently about a book that you didn't read. So I've read many, I've bought more, but those are 3 for you guys to check out.
All right. And we only have 5 minutes left. So what question do you want to answer that I haven't asked you yet?
Maybe something kind of particular to Xander. When I met Kirk McDonald, it was in December of 2012. And I was introduced by Larry Harris, who was CMO, and I met Larry through Philippe Krakowski, who's one of the top people at Interpublic. And, you know, 2 thoughts here. One is, Kirk, I sit down with him I remember it like yesterday, in an office with no windows on a cold day with 2 young associates. And one of the associates is a little nervous with Kirk going through the PowerPoint of our proposal of what we're going to do. And Kirk says, let me take the PowerPoint. Let me drive. This is, people say I'm kind of an ace in PowerPoint. Let me go through it. And he goes, he's the only client that I pitched who took my proposal and basically turned it around on me and said, let me go through it myself. Let me ask the questions. Let me run the slides here. So I love that right away. But on the slide culture, I think Kirk would be the first to admit that it's about the content of the slides. It's not, yes, design matters, but tell me something that's original. Tell me something that I'm not expecting. Be exciting. You know, he often says to people he's mentoring, tell me what really turns you on, what you're most excited to do professionally, and then go out and do it. And back to Philippe, who I talked about, there's a part of the book that maybe you remember, Eddie, of rather than pitching the business with slides, Philippe Krakowski tells a story when he was at BBDO that a colleague from France, also named Philippe by coincidence, comes and pitches the Apple business, not with slides, not with the deck, not with handouts, not with a microsite, not with a blog, but on a white t-shirt, back, side, forward, just takes off the t-shirt, walks around the room, and one kick-ass idea after the other. So that's the primitive spirit in a nutshell.
Well, thank you so much. We've run out of time, but I want to thank you, Marco, for joining us, and congratulations on the new book.
Thank you, Eddie.
You're welcome.
At AT&T and Xander, especially Kirk and Rob and you, Eddie, and Jesse and Heidi and everyone for giving me this opportunity.
Absolutely.
Hope it's
absolutely. So I want to thank Jesse and Heidi and everyone that you just mentioned. Everyone, if you haven't read the book yet, you can order it. It's available now on Amazon and everywhere where books are sold. And we're so happy you could join us. And I hope we all get a little bit more primitive in our lives. So thank you so much and have a great day.
You made it fun and easy.
Good. All right, sir. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.